Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Tonkin campaign of 1883 to 1886. Henri Riviere picked up after Gagné and got himself killed on the Paper Bridge. In the face of an unauthorized and failed Tonkin campaign, that should have been the nail in the coffin. But a new administration took hold in France, and they were certainly more gung-ho about colonizing Southeast Asia. General Bouet picked up after Riviere, but he was met with some failure and uninspiring victories. He quit his job, and it fell to Admiral Corb to continue France's campaign to take on all of Tonkin. However, to defeat the Black Flag army of Leo Yong Fu was a tricky thing, as the Ching Dynasty was covertly supporting them. France had to decide if she would continue, for if she did, it might mean another war against the Ching Dynasty. This episode is the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885 Part 1, the Battle of Fujo. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Where over there I've just finished up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast episode is an interview I did with Chuck Myers. Chuck Myers served the United States Navy aboard multiple aircraft carriers, and he is an associate of the USS Hornet Museum. He was also the main historian consultant who worked on the last Midway film. Thus, we're going to be talking about the USS Hornet and his work on 2019's Midway. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Admiral Corb just received reinforcements in the form of 10,000 men, 6 gunboats, and orders to attack Leo Yong Fu and the Black Flag Army regardless of how it might drag the Qing dynasty into the war. The Black Flag Army had set up camp in the fortified city of Santai, which lay just a few kilometers south of the Red River. The city fort was in a pentagonal formation with walls 11 feet high, surrounded by a deep moat, and within the center was a citadel. The French scouts estimated the fort had well over 100 cannons. This was not going to be a walk in the park, as they say. Leo Yong Fu and the Black Flag Army knew the French would approach Santai from the east, using their gunboats along the Red River. This was because the Black Flag Army had hired European engineers in advance to convert the town north of Santai, blocking its approach into an impregnable strongpoint. Large dikes, water-filled ditches, bamboo palisades, and trenches surrounded it, and offered the Black Flag Army extremely well-positioned defensive lines. Thus, to take a northern route meant the French would have to take Fusa. Leo Yong Fu had roughly 3,000 veteran Black Flag soldiers, 7,000 local Vietnamese troops led by Prince Hoang Ke Vinh, and an additional 1,000 Qing troops led by Tang Jiang. Hoang Ke Vinh's men manned the citadel. Tang Jiang's were inside the city, and the walls and field were the Black Flag Army's responsibility. Over on the other side, Admiral Corb deployed 9,000 of his men for the campaign against Santai, distributed into 2 columns led by Colonels Belin and Bichot. Belin would lead 3,300 men, consisting of 2 Turco battalions, 1 Marine battalion, some Cochin Chinese riflemen, 1 Foreign Legion battalion, 3 Marine artillery batteries, and 800 Tonkinese riflemen. Bichot's group consisted of 3 Marine battalions, some Cochin Chinese riflemen, a Fusilier Marines battalion, and 3 artillery batteries. Both columns departed from Hanoi on December the 11th. Bichot's group were transported up the Red River by the 6 gunboats and made it ashore on the western bank of the Day River, where they secured a pathway for Belin's column to march north. By December the 13th, both columns met up just 5 kilometers away from the 4 defensive lines of Santai. On December the 14th, the French advanced from the east towards the Fuzhou positions, beating back some Black Flag Army sorties against their flanks. They opened fire with their artillery for 2 hours upon the Fuzhou gun emplacements. Then 2 forward battalions seized the most forward defensive position at Fuzhou. But from there they found no way to keep pushing forward. During this action, the French had 68 men dead and around 250 wounded. Thus, in a single day, Admiral Corb had lost more men than both Bouillet and Rivière in all their battles put together. Leo Yong Fu hoped to exploit the French losses by ordering a night raid. This, however, turned into a complete disaster, and not only did he lose a lot of men to the combat, others began to abandon Fuzhou, fleeing for Santai. On the 16th, Corb ordered the men to try and prod Santai from the northwest. The French artillery softened up the defensives before Corb personally rode out to forward positions well within the Black Flag Army's firing range. Corb led the men to attack the western gate of Santai, which was demolished by artillery and explosives. Leo Yong Fu's men quickly withdrew into the citadel as the French stormed into the city. By this point, it seems Leo Yong Fu knew it was too dangerous to defend the city, so he ordered his men to evacuate under the cover of darkness. The French had suffered 83 deaths and a few hundred wounded, while the Black Flag Army were estimated to have nearly 1,000 deaths and another 1,000 wounded, if French sources are ever to be believed. And rest assured, you can't trust the French. The Vietnamese and Chinese troops had evacuated well in advance of the French storming the city, and thus played only a minor role in the battle. Now, the terrible losses the Black Flag Army incurred had a significant consequence going forward. Leo Yong Fu felt his men had intentionally been tossed to the lions by the Chinese and Vietnamese, and he determined going forward that he would not again expose his army so openly. Leo Yong Fu took his army from Santai over to Bac Ninh. Now at this point, Admiral Corb officially handed command of the land forces over to General Charles Théodore Milhaud. Milhaud would take command of the 10,000-man force, which included 2 brigade commanders who had recently made their mark, so to say, in history. General Louis Brière de Lille, the former governor of Senegal, commanding the 1st Brigade, and the 2nd Brigade was commanded by French Foreign Legion General François de Négrier, who had quelled an Arab rebellion in Algeria. And I'll just say it here, for those of you who speak French, I am not going to call François by his last name, because that's pretty messed up that that's his last name. So yeah, from now on, he's just François. On a kind of silly side note, French is my second language, and by no means am I very good at speaking French, as any francophones here who are listening to me probably scratching their ears out when they hear me pronounce some of these names. But I had to ask my significant other, my wife, about that last name, and I was like, is that actually a real thing? And she asserted to me that in older times, apparently people did share that last name, which, just for you English folk, it refers to, I don't know how to put it, an N-word boat would be the only translation. So yeah, François, that's what we're going to call him. Now in Bac Ninh, there was the 3,000-strong Black Flag Army who would now have some very powerful allies. The Qing governor of Guangxi province, Xi Yanxi, was commanding over 20,000 Qing forces with his subordinates, Zhao Wo and Hong Guilan. The soldiers were veterans of the Anhui and Xiang armies, i.e., Li Hangzhang and Zheng Guofan's old forces. Half of the Qing forces were deployed along the Mandarin Road southwest of Bac Ninh, and the other half were deployed east of Bac Ninh along the Chunsan and Dap Cao mountains. General Milhaud gave each brigade 2 marching regiments, each containing roughly 3 infantry battalions apiece. The 4 commanders of each regiment were Colonels de Foix, Bélin, Duchesne, and Berthaud le Vilain. It's an interesting last name there. The Villain. I like that one. Now, despite the numerical superiority, the Chinese forces were quite demoralized, and Leo Yong Fu intentionally was going to keep his Black Flag units out of the real fray of the danger. And these factors came out to play in the battle. The 2 brigades were to approach Bac Ninh from 2 different locations. The 1st Brigade would depart from Hanoi, and the 2nd Brigade from Haizong. Milhaud's primary objective was to capture Bac Ninh, but he was also hoping to annihilate the Qing forces in the process. To manage this, he planned to seize some river crossings around Bac Ninh so that the Qing forces would be unable to escape. These crossings were found north of Bac Ninh at Dapkao and Fukam, which led to Langsun and Tai Nguyen, respectively. On March the 6th, the 1st Brigade were ferried from Hanoi up the Red River to land just due south of some Qing defensive lines along the Mandarin Road. On land, the 1st Brigade marched along the northern bank to head southeast of Bac Ninh to a village called Chi. Meanwhile, the 2nd Brigade advanced from Haizong, going along the southern bank to Songkao, where they attacked some Qing forward positions at Dousan and Neo. While the 2nd Brigade met the enemy on the land, their gunboat support went around behind the Qing lines close to Fulang to begin bombarding them. Upon seeing the French gunboats positioning, the Qing forward units made a withdrawal to Bac Ninh. This allowed the 2nd Brigade to occupy some minor forts and gradually move towards Qi to meet up with the 1st Brigade. The two brigades united and advanced upon Bac Ninh by March the 12th. Forces of the 1st Brigade pushed the Qing out of Chongsun, while forces of the 2nd Brigade seized the village of Xuanhua. The Qing made little resistance at these outposts, basically abandoning them when the French came into visual proximity. Then at 4 p.m., the 2nd Brigade alongside their gunboat support attacked Dapkao, just east of Bac Ninh. The arrival of the French at Dapkao threatened the Qing's defensive lines. The Qing's escape routes to Langsong were being severed off by the seizure of Xuanhua, Langboi, and Dapkao. Thus, the only concern the Qing commanders were thinking of was how to quickly withdraw their men to Langsong before the roads were completely cut off from them. The Qing resistance began to collapse as a result. Morale had dropped, and many were now beginning to rout. The French regimental commanders saw the Qing's left flank was breaking apart, and they believed that they could encircle a large part of the Qing forces. At 5 p.m., the French commanders noticed the Qing flag still flew atop the citadel's tower at Bac Ninh. But between the city, Dapkao, and Chongsun, all that could be seen was fleeing Qing soldiers. The 2nd Brigade attacked Bac Ninh the next morning, capturing large sums of ammunition and, curiously enough, fully functioning modern Krupp artillery pieces that looked so pristine, they figured that none of them had even fired a single shot. Without waiting for the 1st Brigade to come from Chuksan, the 2nd Brigade forced their way into the city of Bac Ninh. In the meantime, the efforts to encircle the fleeing Qing had been thwarted by tenacious rearguard actions by the Qing forces fighting out of Dapkao. Thus, the majority of the Qing forces were able to escape north along the banks of the Songkao River. While the Qing fled, the French gunboats bombarded them, inflicting heavy casualties. General Milo was nowhere near done trying to trap the escaping Qing forces, however, and he sent his 2 brigades after them. The 1st Brigade pursued the enemy as far as Tai Nguyen, where they inflicted casualties upon the Qing, Vietnamese, and Black Flag forces until March of the 19th. The 2nd Brigade annihilated a Qing rearguard force at Fulangtung and chased a large portion of the Qing right flank as they went to a town called Kep. Milo then called his 2 brigades to return to Bac Ninh by March 24th. The French stated that they had 9 deaths and 39 wounded while claiming to have killed 100 enemy units and a few hundred wounded. The defeat of the Qing forces was an enormous embarrassment for the Qing dynasty, and thus for its true leader, Empress Dowager Cixi. The Qing court and the people of China met the news with shock, mostly because they had heard that for a few months the Black Flag Army had managed to inflict heavy casualties upon the French, but their professional forces had utterly failed. Empress Dowager Cixi, in her rage, punished several Qing officials, such as the governors of Guangxi and Yunnan provinces, Xi Yanqi and Tang Shong. Both men were dismissed from their posts. Meanwhile, the field commanders at the Battle of Bac Ninh, Huang Guilan and Zhao Wao, were disgraced. Huang Guilan committed suicide at Langsong on March the 14th as a result of his shame, while some of his chief of staff, Jian Dugui and Dang Mixuan, were beheaded in front of their troops at Langsong on March the 26th. Now, before the major losses, the Qing court had debated the issue of whether or not they should wage a undeclared or declared war against France to keep them out of Vietnam completely. The leader of the moderates was Li Hangjiang, who was seeking diplomacy, while the leader of the hardliners was Jiang Qidong, who was continuously calling for full-scale war. After losing Santai and now Bac Ninh, Empress Dowager Cixi began to see no other way to solve the situation than diplomacy, and thus Jiang Qidong lost favor and Li Hangjiang won it. Cixi ordered Li Hangjiang to begin peace talks, which would occur at Tianjin with Captain François-Ernest Fournier. The French demanded China withdraw her forces from Vietnam and respect France's protectorate over Annam and Tonkin. This would mean China was officially relinquishing its suzerainty over Vietnam, which they capitulated. The result was the Tianjin Accord of May the 11th of 1884. This would be followed up 3 weeks later by the new French minister to China, Jules Patriote, who negotiated a revised Treaty of Saigon. It was to be called the Treaty of Hua, done between France and the Nguyen dynasty, which officiated the protectorship of Annam and Tonkin. In essence, it was a stepping stone to simply making Vietnam a colonial possession of France. The treaty was signed on June 6 of 1884, and it was followed up by a symbolic show where the French melted down a seal that was given to the previous Nguyen emperor, Salam, by the Qing emperor. Now, while the Treaty of Hua and the Tianjin Accord should have ended all of the conflict, well, it did not. No, it seems Mr. Fournier was a bit of a moron when it came to diplomacy, and he royally messed up with the Tianjin Accord. The crucial mess-up was, while the accord stated that the Qing dynasty had to withdraw their forces from Vietnam, it never stated a deadline. The French began to demand the Qing withdraw immediately, while the Qing argued they could not withdraw until minor articles of the said Tianjin Accord were not concluded. Long story short, it was a paradox of a situation, and the Qing were simply using the Accord's other minor issues to maintain their forces where they were. The entire situation was met with uproar from the Chinese people, and this bolstered Jiang Qidong and the hardliners against Li Hangjiang, who began calling for his impeachment. Now, as much as I love Li Hangjiang, he sort of messed up during the Tianjin Accord agreement. He hinted to the French the Qing withdrawal would occur, but that it might see a few snags. This was verbally done, of course. Thus, the French assumed it was a he said, she said type of situation that the Qing forces would immediately withdraw, and of course they didn't. Thus, on the ground, in early June, a French force led by Lieutenant Colonel Alphonse Duchesne advanced to seize the cities of Caobang, That Quay, and Lacsan. His forces formed a long column starting at Fuliangtung as they advanced along the Mandarin Road heading to Lacsan, then Fuxian, Kep, and Kaohsiung by June the 15th. The march was grueling. It was extremely hot, and some flooding made their way very difficult as they had to continuously build bridges. They were forced to set up camp around Kaohsiung, in a smaller town called Baclay, for a few days, and when they continued their march, they began to realize they were being watched by scouts. They sent out advance patrol parties, and some of these were fired upon, but they had no way of knowing who exactly was attacking them. It could be the Nguyen forces, Qing forces, Black Flags, or simply bandits for all they know. Duchesne intended to continue nonetheless, and by June the 22nd, they were on their way to Lacsan. At this point, Duchesne's men came up to a river, and on the other side were Qing troops. Neither side fired upon another, and Duchesne figured they were stragglers from Qing forces that fought at Bac Ninh. Thinking they would not oppose him, he gave orders to cross the river. But little did he know, on the other side were 4,600 Qing troops, armed to the teeth with modern rifles like the rapid-firing Remington types. Now, both sides were well aware of the Tianjin Accord, but back in China, all the bickering against Li Hangjiang led to no official orders for the men to withdraw from Tonkin. In fact, their regional commander, Wang Tubang's, last orders were to hold their positions. On June the 23rd, an advance guard led by Captain Leconte crossed the river as some Qing infantry began to take up defensive positions on a hill 250 meters behind the river. The French went over the river unmolested, but as soon as they landed on the other side, all hell broke loose. The Qing fired intentionally over their heads to try and scare them off, but Leconte reacted by ordering his men to begin flanking the Qing forces. The French troops charged up the hill as the Qing pulled back, allowing the rest of the French forces to cross the river by 11 a.m. Meanwhile, a few hours prior, around 9 a.m., 3 Qing envoys showed up to Duchesne with letters. The letters were from the Qing commanders in the field explaining to Duchesne, while they understood the Tianjin Accord articles, Their official last orders were to hold their position, so they were in quite a pickle. They requested Duchesne send a message back to Hanoi to seek further instructions. Now, Duchesne should have complied with this, but instead he sent word back to the Qing commanders at 3 p.m. stating he would continue his march up the Mandarin Road. Allegedly, Duchesne did this because he assumed the Qing were just going to pull to the side and allow his force to pass. Duchesne gave the orders to his men not to open fire explicitly unless he ordered them to do so as they marched. For quite some time the march went unmolested until the French were going around the Nuit Dong Nai cliffs. Suddenly the Qing forces who had been shadowing the French column opened fire upon their flanks. The French vanguard deployed as best as they could as Duchesne tried to order a bugler to sound a ceasefire call, but it was to no avail. The Qing sounded their own bugles, ordering more men to join the battle, forcing Duchesne to plan a defense. Now, Duchesne was leading 450 French troops and 350 Tonkinese auxiliaries, and to add insult to injury, many of his forces were not veteran troops. His men formed a square formation, digging trenches, and by the late afternoon had repelled multiple attacks and led some minor counterattacks as well. During the night, the Qing brought forward more forces occupying the heights surrounding the French, and in the morning they attacked all sides of the French square. Duchesne made several counterattacks, but without significant numbers nor artillery support, he knew they would soon be encircled and annihilated. By 11 a.m., he ordered a withdrawal to Songtung, abandoning the baggage trains and fighting each step of the way. Despite the intense situation, the officers managed to keep the men orderly, and the withdrawal was done quite effectively. General Milhaud received word of Duchesne's plight, and on June the 23rd, he immediately dispatched the 2nd Brigade to go and save him. The 2nd Brigade reached Duchesne's column near Baclay on the 27th, and they set to make a counterattack to repel the Qing forces back to Songtung. However, just as General François was about to issue orders, he received word from Milhaud, ordering him to get everyone back to Hanoi at once. The French had suffered 22 deaths and 70 wounded during the ambush, and alleged that they had inflicted at least 300 casualties upon the Qing. News of what was to be called the Baclay ambush reached France, prompting Jules Ferry's government to demand an apology in the form of indemnity payments and an immediate implementation of the Tientsin Accord from China. The Qing sought further negotiations, but refused to apologize or pay any indemnities. Negotiations began again, but the mood in both France and China were pure outrage, and the sabers of war were rattling. While negotiations were still going on, the French government sent orders to Admiral Corb to take his recently established Far East Squadron to give battle to the Qing Navy at Fujo. Admiral Corbet's Far East Squadron during late August consisted of 13 ships, just a fraction of what it would become later on. He had the 5 ironclads on hand, though they were all over the place performing missions. There was Bayard, his flagship, Charpe, Atalante, Trafanate, and La Galissonière. He also had the cruisers Duguay III, Villa, Destin, Volta, and the gunboats Lynx, Aspic, Viper, and 2 torpedo boats. The Qing Fujian fleet had 11 Western-style ships and 11 Chinese war junks in the region. The Qing flagship was the wooden corvette Yangwu, followed by the scout transports Fupao, Xian, Yongbao, Qianhang, Yixin, and the wooden gunboats Jianwei, Fuxian, Jianxin, and Fusheng, alongside the 12 Chinese war junks. In terms of crews, the French would have 1,780 versus 10,040 for the Qing. In terms of firepower, the French were overwhelmingly better armed, with the Qing having only a few ships that were capable of return fire. Overall, command for the Qing was led by Imperial Commissioner Zhang Peilun. Admiral Corb arrived at Fujo and anchored near the port of Fujo on August 22nd, observing the Qing fleet deployed with a northern group consisting of 8 ships and a southern group consisting of 3 ships. Corb placed his squadron between these clusters and observed his enemy. The Qing ships were seen to swing with the tides, prompting Corb to plan for his attack to commence at the top of the tide roughly around 2 p.m. the next day. He deduced the Qing ships would swing away from his fleet, presenting their vulnerable sterns. The Qing northern group seemed to be protecting the Fujo dockyards, while the southern group seemed to be protecting a customs building. Assuming the Qing would not change their formations, Corb hoped to begin battle at 2 p.m. with his torpedo boats first, then cannon fire by the rest. The next day, neither side made any attempt to redeploy or mess with each other, and by 1:30 p.m. the French crews were preparing for battle. The Qing seemingly did nothing upon witnessing the French clearly preparing their ships for a fight by 1:45 p.m. But then, at 1:55 p.m., Qing mine boats began advancing towards the French ships. Corb immediately raised flags for attack commencement, 5 minutes before the expected timetable. Torpedo boat number 46 surged forward, hitting the Yangwu with a spar torpedo. For those of you who don't know what that is, picture an extremely long pole poking in front of your ship with a bomb on its end. Yes, the idea is quite simple. You rush headfirst towards an enemy ship, jab the pointed pole at the hull of the ship, and detonate the bomb on the end using a fuse. Gonna say this right now. Takes a lot of balls to pull this off, to be sure. The bomb blast damaged torpedo ship number 46's boiler and ruptured the hull of the Yangwu. Meanwhile, torpedo boat number 45 tried to do the same action to the Fupo, with much less success in her venture. As the two torpedo boats made their daring escapes under heavy fire, the French cruisers and ironclad triomphant began opening fire. The Yongbao, Feiyun, Fushen, Jiangsheng, Jian, and Qianhang were lit ablaze or sunk by shell fire. Only the Fupo and Yixin survived the onslaught, forced to flee upriver as they were chased by the gunboats Lynx, Viper, and Aspic. The Jinwei received a shell hit from the Triomphant, causing a large explosion. Before the carnage had unfolded, the Qing had concentrated their fire upon the Volta, which Corb was forced to use as his flagship at the time, as the Bayard did not make it in time for battle. The Qing clearly did this in order to kill Admiral Corb, hoping it would create a decisive victory. Several crew aboard the Volta were killed or wounded, and a round shot smashed through her bridge, nearly killing the captain, Guigon. By 5 p.m. the fighting had died down, but during the night, the Qing made several unsuccessful fireship attacks. The next day, Admiral Corb ordered his ships to land some companies ashore to set up explosives and destroy the Fujo dockyards, but upon seeing the Qing left infantry to defend them, he was forced to cancel the plans. Instead, he had his fleet begin bombarding the dockyards and outer buildings, but was unable to completely destroy the yards. The ship stayed at anchor another day, as the Qing attempted a night torpedo attack against the gunboat Viper, who was anchored on the outside of the formation. Searchlights picked up the torpedo attempts, and they were fired upon until they gave up. On August 25th, Corb took his forces down the Min River, with Triomphant and the Duguay-Tran leading the way. For 2 days, he had his forces bombard some Qing shore batteries defending the approach to Fujo, followed by some forts at the Santai Pass. In the end, the French had 10 deaths, 48 wounded, due mostly to sniper fire, with 2 ships receiving some light damage. The Qing lost 9 ships completely, with the others running aground, severely burnt, or damaged in various other ways. The estimated death toll was something between 2,000 to 3,000. The Qing put up a memorial shortly after the war commemorating a list of 831 sailors and soldiers killed on the 23rd. But the list does not include the deaths incurred during the Min River voyage. The captain of the flagship Yangwu had abandoned his ship prematurely, and he was beheaded later for cowardice. Countless men lost their jobs, like the governor-general of Fujian and Zhejiang provinces, Hui Jing, the governor of Fujian province, Zhang Jiaotong, and the director-general of Fujo dockyards, He Wujiang. Zhang Peilun, who made no significant efforts to direct the Fujian fleet, was degraded and replaced by our old friend, General Zhou Zhaotang. The Battle of Fuzhou, put simply, was a shit show for the Qing. There were numerous factors that led to the humiliating defeat. A major factor was actually Germany making excuses not to send the new Dingyuan and Jinyuan over in time. Also, the Fujian fleet received absolutely zero help from the other fleets, despite Zhang Peilun pleading for help from the Beiyang fleet, Nanyang fleet, and Guangdong fleet, even with direct orders from Empress Dowager Cixi in hand. These fleets all had respective commanders who were loath to see any of their assets damaged, and thus they all held back. Corruption in full view, a major part of the Qing Dynasty, and a major part for their downfall. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've just now finished up my multi-part series on China's warlord era. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is an interview I did with Chuck Myers. Chuck Myers is a retired man from the United States Navy serving aboard many aircraft carriers, and he is an associate at the USS Hornet Museum. He also happens to be the main historical consultant for the recent Battle of Midway film, Midway. Thus, the interview is about the USS Hornet's history and his work on Midway, and I must say, it's a really entertaining episode. Please check it out, it would mean a lot to me. Incompetency and corruption led to a huge loss at the Battle of Fuzhou. Now the Qing Dynasty had really gotten herself into a mess in a full-scale war with France. It was only the beginning, it was about to get a whole lot worse.